I welcome to the podcast today a former three-term councillor from the city of Waterloo. He was first elected at age 30 in Ward 6, the Central Columbia Ward, in 2010, and was successfully elected for two more terms in 2014 and 2018 before stepping down after three very active terms as a councillor and, during his last two terms, acting as a chair of the Finance Committee. During all of that time, he managed to get his master's in planning at the University of Waterloo. I'm pleased to welcome to the Old Grey Mares podcast, Jeff Henry. Jeff, welcome.
Thanks, Rob. Good to be here.
Yeah, so I was curious about the master's in planning that you decided to get. First of all, why don't you tell our listeners what your educational background was going into being a counselor prior to?
Sure. Yeah, like so many people, I moved from the GTA here into Waterloo to go to the University of Waterloo. I took computer engineering as my first degree. Turns out lots of my classmates were really good at all the stuff you use every day, and that really wasn't my passion. So my class went off to the Valley and to Seattle and Vancouver, and then these days they'd have stayed here in Waterloo region. And I went into student politics. And while I was doing the student union level politics, I did a Bachelor of Arts in political science. The university would pay for some of it for their employees, which was great. But let me learn about the theory of all the practice I was doing in politics to understand people around me. So that was the background that I had in it prior to joining council, where I then did a planning degree for the same reason.
Let me just back up for a second. So you got this computer engineering degree, but you end up going into a field that doesn't really apply the engineering degree.
Well, part of the pitch I made in the first campaign around that was that I could bridge the conversational divide. No, I know you're not in the campaign, but this was my pitch. This was my pitch even for the student politics side of things, right? It's that you can bridge the gap between different disciplines, and I could speak engineering and I could speak arts, and that's a huge divide on campus, right? And I was a better practitioner at helping people understand technical details that made sense to non-technical people than I ever was at doing the technical things myself.
Okay, so your passion was in that direction more so than being the programmer or what have you, or whatever you do.
Oh God, like I thought I loved it when I came, but my God, I definitely hated it by the time I was done.
And that's okay. I mean, a lot of kids will say, because we're kids when we go to university, right? Go off to think they want to do something and switch gears later on. Nothing wrong with that in terms of finding yourself. I remember there was a book called "What Color Is Your Rainbow," and it was basically about where do you land in terms of employment opportunities, what sort of things interest you, where do you want to go, and things change over time, and you never know for sure what path you go. But you obviously found a passion in this area of advocacy and eventually public service. Yeah,
and that's you learn by doing, right? And I had the honor of being able to do that very quickly. In the student politics world, I was chair of a federal lobby association on behalf of sort of post-secondary students, about 24 universities across the country and colleges that were part of that. So I was on the Hill. I was in the PMO, and I saw Stephen Harper when he was leader of the opposition. And you're trying to convince them to do things that are good, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah, right. You're in heavy on federal politics, provincial politics as well.
Yeah. We had I didn't have a title. I was just one of the gang of 6 or 7 that we had working provincially, and we were very successful. I met Bob Ray when he was doing a post-secondary review for the McGuinty government, and we got a lot out of that process. So I learned a lot about how to change politicians' minds and get things done for constituents when I was young.
So you must have had, though, this is interesting because I remember my own path was being actively involved in various predominantly federal and provincial campaigns. And so you always have this vision or idea that maybe that's where you want to go. And you don't really think of the municipal field or arena as a spot to be effective or of interest. Did you go through that sort of internal reflection?
Absolutely. That was like I came of age in the 90s. My parents were teachers. I walked the line with my teachers and was at Queen's Park during the tumultuous Harris years. So I cut my teeth on provincial politics, and I always thought
Yeah.
that's where I'd be most interested on education policy and the rest, because it's just so important. But during the student advocacy role, the city of Waterloo was having challenges with student accommodation, and some of my colleagues were working with the city on actually the first plan in the sort of area near campuses that I ended up representing, which we'll get to later.
Yeah.
But I saw through osmosis the city work on planning issues and student housing issues, and I wasn't engaged on that, but it was sort of niggling in the back of my mind. But
Right,
I hadn't
right.
I hadn't thought about municipal politics too much. I was very focused elsewhere.
In our discussion before today's show, you'd mentioned Leadership Waterloo, and just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, Leadership Waterloo Region was an organization started in 2000 to sort of say, look, there's lots of old gray mayors, there's old gray leaders as well. How do we get the next generation involved?
And a lot of young leaders too.
Yeah, and so the idea between the old leaders was, how do we get the young leaders? And so Leadership Waterloo Region, there were other versions of this in other areas of the continent, was trying to train the next generation and get them engaged in the community and understand and plugged in. And so in my second round of student politicking, I joined. I took the program for a year, and that really exposed me to parts of the region I hadn't seen, problems that we were having in the region that I didn't know a whole lot about. Right, one of the first visits we had was down to the Cambridge Self-Help Food Bank, which gave me two insights: one on poverty and how food banks work, two on Cambridge. At the end of that, I was asked to join the board of the Canadian Mental Health Association's local branch here in the region and in Guelph, and so that was even further exposure. At that time, I was working at the University of Waterloo in sort of student support services, and among my many hats was dealing with students that had either mental health challenges or addiction challenges or other things go wrong in their educational journey, and when they ended up on my doorstep, things were really wrong because we were trying to figure out how to sort of patch things up. So I went through Kleenex in my office. I felt like I was. Yeah, I didn't have a bachelor of social work, but boy, I felt like I was learning that on the job from osmosis. So being able to connect on that was really helpful.
But they could let somebody know, and you were listening and trying to find opportunities to help them through that, especially with the young kids, especially now when they're 17 and heading away from home. I know I have 3 daughters and went through that whole. I know you have young Finn, so you'll be looking forward to that sooner than you realize. And all of a sudden, they're like, "Okay, I'm off to university." And you're like, "Well, wait a minute, when did this all happen?" They're so young.
Yeah. The RESP is there, but the idea that it will be drawn from is years in the future.
Exactly. So how is it then? Leadership Waterloo, great organization. Unfortunately, I think it's not operating anymore. It ran into some funding problems.
In the last year, it seems to have fizzled on the vine. Yeah.
Which is very unfortunate and sad to see that go, because look, it's created so many people who've been able to learn more about contributing back to the community. I mean, you can't add up or value the positives that come out of that. So how is it then that you decided to run for council then?
Well, I was doing a lot of community events. I was involved sort of in provincial, party politics and the rest. And so I was starting and done some board work and Leadership Waterloo Region and the others. So I was starting to be known. But I was at a community event in downtown Kitchener, and an individual sort of tapped me on the shoulder, Benton Leong of the Waterloo Voter Support Committee, the citizens trying to help people understand what's going on and encourage more people to run. Right. And he said, "Jeff, have you considered running municipally?" And I had not. But then I'd spent the next 3 months trying to figure out if I should, and then if I should, how. And so that really turned my mind from looking provincially to looking locally and understanding that maybe there was a role I could play, and watching things play out on council and then making a decision to run.
Do you recall what some of the things were that you did to help you formulate your decision?
Well, I started going to council meetings, watching what was happening, and watching the decisions that were being that were being made. I went to the New Year's levee and sort of talked to mayor and council. I'd already been seeing some of the existing, councillors out at community events and having conversations with them, but just to get a flavor of what the issues are and what was coming downstream. And it was quite obvious to me that there was a role that I could play as someone that really tries to build sort of consensus and understanding between issues, because council seemed to be having some challenges making decisions or responding to some issues in the community. There was talks about amalgamation was in the air back in 2010, right, as well. It was showing up on the ballot, and council was sort of, rather than taking positions, was punting questions to community, and I saw a role for council to play there. Similar on fluoridation as an important health intervention, but again, just we could have medical experts, or we could punt it to the community and make a decision sort of by counting really angry heads, right?
So
the light rail transit was coming up, so there's a whole lot of issues that were sort of showing up.
Right.
And then in the ward I ended up running in, there were increasing bubbling tensions between long-term residents and sort of newer, shorter-term residents, people that might become long-term residents who are going to school. Right, the student non-student tensions were huge, and those were areas I thought I could contribute to. So I was watching those happening, thinking, you know what, I can do something about that. I can help.
So let's because you say something about that. There's a whole lot of that's in that comment that you just made. So, for example, I know when I did the podcast with Melissa Durrell, similar to sort of what you said. I mean, obviously, as a reporter, she's observing council meetings all the time, and you're watching council meetings as part of your preparation or decision making process. And she sort of has a similar concept, a comment that she's watching these council meetings and feeling that decisions that maybe should have been made were not being made and being punted down the road, as you say. So I found that interesting. Yeah,
it's and she and I got to share an office for the 8 years that she was there. Waterloo buddies up, right? Nobody gets their own space. Everybody.
It happens in Cambridge. Cambridge is the same too, and half of regional council, the mayor's always the township mayor's always buddied up. So
and so we then not to get too far ahead of it, but it's we were the two newbies in the 2010 council. 6 people, including the mayor, returned, and we were the two newbies, and we shared an office, and we were able to sort of help each other through the growing pains of drinking from the fire hose of information and challenge that is joining council, and sort of help each other out. And we had, I think, complementary personalities and orientations to dealing with issues. But Melissa had 14 ideas every minute, and I had a whoa, let's talk this through and see what we might do about one or two of those things, right? And so we worked very well together.
And you can say 14 things in a minute.
I can say 14 things in a minute, or I can say one thing 14 ways in a minute. But yeah, we got along famously, I think.
The other thing you mentioned, though, is going into 2010, you also commented, council can make a decision or punt it to a referendum.
Yeah.
What's your? I mean, I'm of the view that, look, you're elected as a councillor, you make the decisions. You can't do everything by referendum. But give me your thoughts about that. I wanted to explore what you had said there further. What your thought process was.
Well,
there.
this is this sort of comes from doing politics in practice and then trying to learn about it in theory. So I think this is where part of the grounding in political theory and different modes of democracy and understanding what it meant and the role of people and representatives was something that's played a lot into my mind on that. The system we have is representative democracy. You elect people to go off, learn a bunch of stuff, and make decisions. And there's a role for citizens that sort of ebbs and flows, but the larger the community, the harder it is for people to be individually involved in these things, and the more you trust in folks to make decisions. And life is very complex these days, right? The idea that you can boil down complex social or political issues into a black and white, yes, no, count heads question, it is rarely something that is the best mechanism, in my view, to sort of deal with these complex interrelated challenges that we're facing, because they're not black and white. They're not that simple.
Right. And hence, when I was first elected mayor of North Dumfries Township, Ken Sealing's one of the first comments to me was that your circle of friends gets smaller. And it's because you start making decisions that are not going to be in favor with some of your friends. And eventually those things do happen because you're tasked with making decisions. The community through election has said, you make decisions on our behalf. You run this thing called the municipal government. And if we're not happy, we'll see you in 4 years. That's, to me, the general approach.
Yeah. Well, and over time, you're a rolling stone. You gather some moss. It slows you down, and sometimes you have to tell your campaign team on the re-elect. It's like that. We're not going to knock on that door. They're currently embroiled in a lawsuit with the city that they blame me for, so we're not going to knock on that door.
So it's just, and we'll get to this thing about the tension, because that sort of lead to Northdale when you're talking about the existing neighborhood and the universities. And it harkens back to my days as a Laurier student, and Albert Street, one side of the street with the beautiful homes, and the other side of the street with all these student housing. But
you weren't the ones burning couches on Ezra back in the early 90s.
Not on Ezra, no. And actually, my wife lived on Ezra way before Ezra became Ezra. So
became a brand. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. So just tell us about the election. So I'm sure your opponents didn't say they were going to use your young age against you during the campaign.
Well,
okay. Tell us about it.
I think I don't know how well it worked. I do know that one of the candidates was because you hear, right? You don't get to do anything and not hear back about it, because the grapevine is pretty tight here in the small community. But there was another candidate going around that was saying negative things about what I was trying to do. Saying I remember hearing these like, well, Jeff only ran because nobody else was running, so he's really just trying to get in. He's not really here for the. I filed third. I filed third.
I was going to ask you, did you file first?
I filed third. But just factually inaccurate pieces that were going out. And I remember at the Rogers debate, back when Rogers still hosted, ward councillor debates.
Don't get me started on that after this last campaign.
I was my debate was the 41st out of 41 that they turned down. We were the last one in the cycle. I looked up my notes the other day from that, and I thought, that was interesting. But no, because you're chock-a-block. There were 4 candidates in our race. It was an open seat because the incumbent was running for mayor and lost.
So just that was Jan
Dai was the incumbent in Ward 6. He got elected in 2003, the post-Rim Park turf everybody on council and bring in new people elections.
It was a sea change.
And also all-male election, which brought the Women's Municipal Campaign School and so much great change, including in Waterloo.
Some good things do happen out of some questionable things.
The all-male council resulted in us now actually leading the country, I think, in having sort of a council that sort of has women leadership dominating. And that did for my terms as well. But getting back to like the Rogers debate, there's 4 of us standing next to each other. Everybody's got their notes on their tiny little podiums, and I see on the candidate next to me that he's got an entire sheet of attack lines he's trying to use against me. I see them. Like I see the headline on the other piece. He wasn't able to use them.
Yeah.
But these are the kinds of things that happen during a campaign. I got to do a closing statement first. I never wrote those down ahead of time. I wrote them during the during the debate to sort of react to the debate. Rather than come in having it stand pat. But I saw his sitting next to me. I got to go first. He had a couple of lines in there, so I just worked those in, and it just sort of totally threw off the next. Anyway, so if you're going to come in with a sheet of things to attack Jeff with, I'll just use one of your turns of phrase that you were going to lead in with, and that was Sometimes campaigns you can have a little bit of fun.
I do recommend, though, having something written just in case, because I remember the very first time I ever did this was when I was running for mayor. And so you have your opening and then you have your closing. And I had an opening and I was like halfway through it when time was up. So I realized, when I was doing the closing, I stuck to the script, read it quickly to make sure I got it all in on time.
I had one of those where based on how the opening went, I had some. I was scratching off some things during the debate. It's like, nope, can't get to that. Nope, can't get to that. Nope, can't get to that.
So you ran then, just to wrap that up on the election, then you ran against, there was a former politician, Mike Connolly.
Yeah.
And who else were you up against?
Ed Korshwitz, who is the Neighborhood Association president in Beechwood Park, and actually lived just down the hill from Mike Connolly, and also Ann Crow, who's a doctor with Grand River, who lives actually in the shadow of my building over on the other side. She's just down the street from me.
She was a candidate.
Yeah.
Wow, because I know she does some work through Freeport as well. I've actually had some clients that have been seen by her. I didn't realize that. Wow.
Yeah, and the thing about municipal politics is I won with 30% of the vote. I had about 250 votes clear. The rest of them were all clustered within 30 or 40 votes of each other. So I was ahead above some of the rest, but so I felt pretty good about that. But you never get rid of these folks, because they're still your neighbors. So we'll get to Northdale, but like the committee we set up of citizens on that had Mike Connolly and Ann Crow on it.
Okay.
And the sort of neighborhood stuff in Clare Lake, there was a huge fiasco in the Beechwoods around sort of a
There's a human-made sort of
pond. Cleaning that up that had gone on for years, and I was on the councils that finished the job. I didn't start it, but Ed Korshwitz was sometimes on those meetings. So they were all around. And then not to get too far ahead, when Mike Connolly passed away, his widow a year later moved not just into my building, but onto my floor at the end of the hall. So it's a small, and we had great chats over the coffee socials that we were having in our condo building. So it's a small town, right? You run against these folks. You can't run too hard, because you're always going to be next to them.
Yeah, can you imagine? Wasn't Mike Connolly on regional council? I think him and Doug Craig were quite the mavericks on that. So just dealing with that would have been.
The 90s were an interesting time.
Yeah, it would have been something else. But so that brings up the point that through municipal politics, one nice thing is we don't have party politics. So you can work with anyone, no matter what their stripe may be, on issues that you mutually are interested in, or even different, but bringing different opinions together, and then just going together and working on the next thing together, which is what I found kind of refreshing about municipal politics. You're able to, you're not tied to a leader or a platform.
Yeah, you get to think your own thoughts, and you're responsible for them, and choosing whether or not it's appropriate to sort of say them out loud.
So let's just give me a quickie. We talked about this on term limits, and I just want to get your view about that, because you ran, you were there for 3 terms, you decided not to run, and we'll talk about that. But what is your view on term limits? I was just curious.
I don't think it helps to constrain choices that people have in elections. I think when a politician has reached their best before date, the electorate can smell it. And certainly Waterloo's history, they've been very good at turfing people when they feel that they're done. I mentioned the 2003 in 100% turnover, because they were just done with council
after the Rim Park issue came to light.
But telling folks they can't have representatives around the table because they know too many things about how things work, that they're too effective because they've done a lot of stuff over their terms, just because they've been there for a while, is denying the electorate an opportunity to have good representation. It does allow you to kick out bad representation you can't seem to get rid of, but it has a negative, right?
Just to be clear, a term limit is just that they're turfing them because they've been there 3 times, not because they still have good ideas or don't have good ideas. So it's just whether they've been there too long or not.
That's right. All. Exactly. There are fresh faces that have really old ideas. And there are folks that have been around for a while that reinvent their views because they're engaged with the community. Right. Like I went back through 3 campaigns, and I could point to evolution of where I had an evolution of views or emphasis on certain aspects of what we focused on. Right. Sometimes it was I got in term 3 where I wanted to be in term 1 but knew the community wasn't there yet. But by term 3 we were, because we worked on it.
And that's funny you mentioned that, because we had this discussion too. Again, I'll bring up Melissa Durrell's comment about how long things take, and we did this show on the Mary Allen Park situation. And I kind of said, well, I guess sometimes once you're inside, you realize it does take time with all the different parties and everyone else involved. People don't realize how much consultation, how many different levels of government and staff and community engagement that you want to do to bring everybody in before you make a final decision on something, which to someone might seem, oh, that's the obvious decision right from the start.
Yeah, the fix was in. That was always the decision. It's like, no, the number of off-ramps between the start and the end where that would not have happened. People don't really see how many opportunities things have to get derailed on the way to good.
Just to wrap up on the term limit comment, I guess going back to your point, there is some truth to that, because before Brenda, who was a 2-term mayor, you had a string of 1-term mayors in Waterloo.
Yeah, Waterloo was quite happy to try you once and then try somebody else, which was Brenda bucked the curve, and then Dave Jaworski came in and he did 2 terms, and Dorothy in her inaugural address basically said something that she shouldn't, which is that she hopes that she could have a second term. You don't say that on your first day, but it is something that, so it would be a new tradition.
Well, it harkens back to that age when you look back at these 1-year term mayors, like so many people, 1 year, and then someone else comes in for a year, another person for a year. It just seemed very odd when you look back at the historical representation.
And we can do budgets another time, but like the old way of doing big capital projects was you had to go to the public and get authorization through a vote before you could debenture money that would extend across a couple of terms. So you'd spend that 1 year or 2 years on council pitching doing something, then you vote on it, and then if you get back in, well, now you can do it, right? And it's a different way of doing things.
So I just want to, when you were getting up to speed, because now you're newly elected, I mean, you have some political background from your various lobbying and engaging at the different levels of government. What were some of the things that were important to you right off the bat to sort of get up to speed to become an effective councillor?
Yeah, the 2 issues that flew right out the gate at us, other than the municipal budget, because it was December and that's when those things show up. But the 2 big issues that were really important in the ward, but also citywide, were the sort of student housing challenges and the fraction and the rental housing challenges that we were having in Waterloo. So over Christmas, we got a first draft of updated rental housing licensing regulations, because there were bad actors out there that taking advantage of folks. There were upkeep challenges and tensions between neighbors and rental housing, and issues of safety and illegal conversions of spaces that don't have light or act. So many issues in rental housing pieces, and the city had, through about 6 or 7 years since the courts broke the existing system through a ruling and getting new powers to the municipal act, we're finally ready to start legislating. So that was coming right out as I was coming in. At the same time, the very first meeting, council was approving terms of reference for the Northdale Stakeholder Committee to work on sort of the secondary plan, sort of a new revised planning framework for the neighborhood near Laurier and Waterloo universities, where, again, those simmering tensions had been boiling over for a period of time with long-term residents, and the plan wasn't working for the community, for anybody. And so we had those things right out of the gate that I had to sort of get up to speed on. And in the case of the Northdale piece, I wanted to put a marker down at that very first meeting that the existing condition, that doing nothing was not an option. Typically in these studies, you review the do nothing in addition to the other pieces.
Yeah, it's always the first option, do nothing.
Yeah, well, you're evaluating against something, but the community wanted to see change. So I was changing council direction in my very first minute on council by slashing that out of that direction. And so in the half hour before going down to the council meeting, I was in the director of policy planning's office to run some language by him that I wanted to put in. And so we all understood the language that we were going to put in, and that I was going to suggest and what it meant. And so when the mayor sort of looked to staff when I raised this as a change, they looked at the director of policy and said, "So Jeff says it means this, and that would do these things, and he's new, right? Basically, what do you think about that?
You're the new guy."
Yeah. Well, what do you think about that? And what he said, well, Councillor Henry is correct. This is it will do these things and yada yada yada. Because I got my ducks in a row, and I knew how to do that part on day one because of some past exposure to politics. But it wasn't what I was expecting. Advice I'd gotten after I got elected, Catherine Fife had sort of said, keep your head down for the first 6 months. Don't get into too much trouble. Figure out what to do on all these things. Right. And then, but I didn't have the opportunity or the option. On day one, I had one of the most important issues in the ward coming up, and it needed direction from the ward council.
Right.
So I had to roll up the sleeves, do it.
Yeah, for a lot of people coming in, the advice is keep your eyes and ears open and the mouth shut. But I mean, you had experience in a sense in governance, and obviously you knew enough to check with staff on something you wanted to do right off the hop. So I'm sure that caught some attention from the senior members of your council.
It did from folks that were around, right? I mean, I'd spent a campaign trying to pitch that I would have a thoughtful, deliberative approach to issues, and that I would give you more than 5-word answers on what I thought should happen. That we try to speak in paragraphs. That people deserve to know the reason why folks are doing things, and even if you disagree with me, you understand I've come to it from somewhere. I haven't just had a knee-jerk reaction to it. I've been very deliberative and thoughtful and interested in an issue before I come to a position. And
I just want to say, Northdale is in your ward, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you were the ward councillor, responsible for that. So it was a big part of what you were doing and dealing with.
Yeah, and to orient people who are looking at a map, there's sort of University Avenue, King Street, Columbia Street, and sort of Phillip Street. So the boundaries of Laurier and the University of Waterloo, and a couple of other of those pieces, where I think folks can look around at the skyline and see that over 12 years, there's been a lot of change.
Okay, we'll talk about the licensing thing, and then we'll finish off with Northdale then. So on the licensing piece, I mean, that is still in place today. Is that correct? There's that, because I don't own any rental housing in Waterloo, so I'm not sure what goes on in Waterloo.
Yeah, it is. It's had a number of sort of modest changes because you always make incremental changes to programs as they go through. But yeah, it's still in place today. But
it makes sense to me that there would be this sort of process. I mean, because the city is municipal government's looked at to ensure that people provide spaces that are or people rent spaces that are safe for them, and that's what bylaws are all about. Ensuring that whatever space is created meets certain standards. And that's really what the licensing program is all about. And then there's a cost to maintaining all of that outside of your property taxes, or you can do it all through your property tax base. But this is making those that want to offer space, ensuring that they're providing safe and adequate space. Is that sort of the gist?
Yeah, rental housing is a business. And so it needs some regulation, as any business does, to make sure that it's acting in the public interest and not just in the private interest. Because as I said so many times that I got sick of saying it, everybody deserves a safe place to live. Why are we doing this? Well, that's the 5 or 6 words. And you say a lot more about it, but fundamentally, that's what we were going in for. And Waterloo's had a long history in this area, right? Waterloo started regulating lodging houses in 1985. Arising from some challenges of people in having issues in basements. I can't remember whether there was a death or not, but there was a significant issue
some tragedy, right?
Yeah, some tragedy sparked that regulation. And when we came to the early 2000s period, there was a court ruling in divisional court that basically gutted the rental housing regulations that the city had. The Terry Good sort of decision on those. And made it very difficult for the city's regulatory sphere to work. There were some changes the city lobbied through, town and gowns, so that's sort of this university community groups that are set up in places with big universities and small towns. Lobbied the province. Changes in the Municipal Act came in 2006 to sort of open up some powers to do broader rental housing regulation, not just in lodging houses, but in sort of any rental accommodation, which we targeted around the low-rise space. And so by the time we were at 2010, we'd done all the work. Some others had gone before us. Oshawa and London had sort of dipped their toe in the water. Yeah. So we had some ideas of where the legal pitfalls were and what to do. And we because there were some, there were challenges, right? And so we avoided them. And we had a council ready to regulate on some of that. but it was raucous, right? We released this thing at just after New Year's. Then we go to the New Year's levy, and I spent the entire New Year's levy, the sort of big fun shindig that council sort of hosts the community for skating and cookies at the beginning of the year.
Yes.
And I had a lineup of angry landlords in front of me the entire time. Yeah. Including somebody who was telling me, pointing at his 6-year-old who's standing beside him, saying, what you're doing will mean that my kid can't go to college. No. In front of the kid. And we were called Nazis. We were called, Chairman Mao. We were called Marie Antoinette. We were called Stalin. We were called everything on the political spectrum that shows these folks needed poli-sci 101.
You're a Trojan horse candidate.
So there was, it was raucous, and then we had to start getting the public in, right? So I did lots of meetings on that right away, and we made some amendments.
Public meetings on the proposed legislation, and there would be some modifications. Did it get approved during your first term?
Yeah, we had that approved by May 2011. Okay. So inside the first 6 months, we released it and done a couple of drafts and got that done. And this was also where I was introduced to sort of politics on the fly. There was sort of a triumvirate of councillors that sort of controlled, not controlled, but sort of council usually went the way that the group.
They were influential.
Sort of went. They were influential, the mayor and a couple of others. And on the way out of an in-camera session to go into the meeting to make a decision, they dropped a bunch of amendments on us. Hadn't seen them. That they wanted to make to them, and so that made for an interesting meeting. I managed
friendly amendments,
amendments they wanted to make to sort of deal with some feedback that they'd heard. One was on changing we had different classes of licenses, but the most common one was limited to sort of you could rent 3 beds, and they said, well, it should be 4. Landlords had sort of asked for some of this. Community was sort of pushing back. And the other was whether there should be criminal record checks for landlords. And there was 1 or 2 others that were relatively easy to deal with. But I pushed back on eliminating the criminal record check. And I won that argument at council. That was one of my, I forget whether I got that one 4-3 or 5-3, through, but I held the line on that and pushed back against that group on the size of spaces from 3 bedrooms to 4. The argument was made that, well, this is trying to align these regulations with fire code regulations. And so during a break, I pulled the chief aside, or the deputy chief, fire chief who was on that, and said, is this true? Like, I haven't had time to vet this. And he says, and he said, that's true. This would be helpful because of this and this reason. Like, okay, I can agree to that, right? Like I can, but it was fast and furious. And these were the early days of the public having Twitter. So I'd gotten a note through my email because I think my wife was watching Twitter, and she said, Jeff, look at this. This is the idea that this would disappear. The criminal record check piece is blowing up. Right? Right.
Yeah.
And so it was useful to sort of know that if I was fighting a fight, it was there are people reacting live to what the heck are you people doing? And these were folks that had supported it in part because this was going to be in. And we were the only municipality that went through this rental housing licensing piece that had student association support, right? Most of them were pushing back because the landlords scared them about cost, right? And that didn't end up really happening. But they were scared about that. And so in every other municipality that were trying it, the students were against. They were in favor here because we'd worked very hard on that. And I was losing them, right? So it was very important to sort of push, because it was very important to say we all did it. Right? We did it together.
Yeah. I think that process, what you're just describing, shows you the importance of, do you think whether, someone's watching something and deciding, should I participate or not participate? I don't know if it matters or not matters. Err on the side of participating, because you never know exactly what's gonna grab and what's gonna happen, and offer your voice in the public debate.
Yeah, so it's important to hear from folks. I mean, you don't always get the decision you want, but it's important.
I mean, you need police checks for all sorts of things. And I think I needed a police check for something on regional council. I forget what it was that I had to get. So, I mean.
Yeah, it's common and pervasive.
Yes.
And heck, the police station just opened next to all the rental housing here in Waterloo, so it's not hard to go into North Division. Yeah,
just a coincidence.
it just happened to be where the lazy boy was. That's where the police went into in Waterloo.
So you got it in. It stayed in place. Were there court challenges, or there weren't court challenges?
Yeah. Yeah. We were taken to court. We knew that.
Yeah.
But I think I can't remember whether we went full on decision or whether it was dismissed or whether, but it survived the court challenge.
Okay.
Because a similar court challenge had been filed in other jurisdiction and came down in the municipality's favor. So I mean, they were also barking up a tree that had been barked up before, which makes it easier for the defendants on that case.
Yeah, right.
Or the respondents, I guess.
Let's jump to Northdale now. So, so to talk about, so Northdale is that area you described. It's a pretty massive area. It's, we would always characterize that as student housing generally. You know, I can remember as a young kid biking my way from Erb and Weber up to St. David's when I went there from grade 7 to 10. And I'd be biking up Regina Street, up the hill to Columbia. You know, yeah, just these houses. Yeah, it was a big hill, but it took me off of King. And but you know, I remember years later going up that same route, not biking, but I was driving, and I was stunned by the number of large dwellings that apartments and condos or apartments or what have you that suddenly populated everywhere. But you know, tell us about the genesis of the whole Northdale issues that arose.
Yeah. So, and actually, while I was in a research group while I was doing my master's work that looked at a 30-year history of student housing regulation and policies in the city of Waterloo. So, I mean, I could give a much longer take.
Yeah, no, we don't have time for that.
We don't. But there are papers published that became part of the dissertation of a colleague of mine who's now a professor in Montreal and is getting quoted in the press around international students in housing these days. So it's a small circle. But anyways, it's a very short synopsis. If you think back to sort of the early 2000s period, you had something called the double cohort. That's where grade 13 was eliminated in Ontario.
Right,
you were going to get a bumper crop of 2 times the normal graduates all heading off to university. And municipalities like Waterloo went, oh my God. Right? What are we going to do about this huge influx of people? At the same time, the city of Waterloo was starting to hit its boundaries. It was forecasting was going to run out of land. Regional growth management strategy is something they were talking about regionally that led to LRT and other things. But we need to start growing up rather than continuing to grow out. And for Waterloo, that wasn't just a nice to have. There was no space to keep growing out. It had to grow up. Right. And so those two things are landing at the same time in the early 2000s. Student accommodation study, how are we going to account for the growth of the universities, including the double cohort, and how are we going to accommodate population growth in general? Huge community process. I was doing student politics then. That's where I was seeing this for the first time. And so the first Northdale plan, as I'd call it, came into fore in 2003 through 2005. And it was build up along the avenues, right? Allow more density along Columbia and King and University and fill up. And this neighborhood inside, this 1950s neighborhood with people that moved into original houses and now we're sort of aging in place.
Yeah,
and
I knew people growing up. I knew people in those areas.
And we're overrun by sort of rental housing, in part because of the Terry Good decision at court that meant the city couldn't space these out anymore. These things were just starting to be taken over. They felt overrun. And so they said, well, the city's plan was suck them out of the neighborhood into all this new density around the edges. Right? That was basically the 2005 plan, the nodes and corridors, height and density policy review, but with the student accommodation spin. And they made regulatory changes to housing to try to space out rental housing. So I got the order wrong. That changed 2 years later.
Regina King area would be that periphery then area?
Yeah. And it extended beyond sort of the today boundaries of Northdale. It went north of Columbia into the neighborhood. It went around but to try to say, let's put more housing here so we can have less housing there to take pressure off of the neighborhood. Right. So the first part worked. The second part didn't. And we got new housing, which was great. And we got, issues, but the sucking sound didn't happen in the neighborhood. Part of that, and I had the order wrong, the court decision came after this, and so the spacing part of the regulation didn't pan out.
Right.
And so you couldn't space them out, and everybody was saying, and so the residents by the time 2010 was coming around were just ticked at the city. They didn't trust the city. The city and the councillor and council was saying, like, look, we've we've got a 20-year plan. It's 5 years in. What do you mean you want to tear it up? Right. We put all this work in. Let's see how it works. And the residents were not having any of it. And so I joined their cause in the campaign, which is not an unuseful thing to do to get elected. But I also agreed the plan wasn't working. Back in 2004, I know that the plan we'd suggested as a students' union as the university, the city didn't do. And I thought we should try that one. And so I had an idea of what it was that might work. Which was more density and sort of corner stores and those kinds of mixed use neighborhood to introduce density and vibrancy and say that's what this place should be. Look at the location. It's what it's screaming out to be. Yeah. Instead of rundown 1950s houses overrun by too many people stuffed into them, how about we have new housing that meets the new needs and meets the new century, right? It's mixed use, it's sustainable, people can walk, all that stuff. That was it. So
just pause for a second. So it seems like initially it's like, these established residents are concerned. And so the municipality tries to respond with a plan that deals with their concern of preserving their neighborhoods as they were through the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s, that sort of thing. By this, as you say, intensify around the outer edges, and that'll lessen the need for converting these homes to student houses. But because of the growth in the population base of the students, it wasn't happening. And so they continue to have these issues in the core. And now you've brought a different viewpoint to it, basically.
Yeah. And I, by the way, finished third in the poll in Northdale because the residents thought that they should all just get all the rental licenses they possibly could. They didn't like the density plan when we started. So I did not do well in Northdale. With sort of but I vetted it through some of my colleagues who had taken planning degrees and that this could work. And so here we are. We're starting this process. We're forming this sort of stakeholder committee of universities, student associations, long-term residents. We brought in some mixed-use developers.
This is this is right out of the gates, so you said, right? This whole Northdale plan.
Yeah, first meeting, set the terms of reference, then recruit, and then in 2 months we had people and we had a committee. Wow. And here's the terms of reference to hire an outside consultant because nobody trusted the city to do the work. Mm-hmm. And so we went outside to do some of that. We formed the terms of reference, we brought them in, and the next year we were meeting at least twice a month, 3 hours an evening, thick policy books that we were reading through, probably stacked almost as tall as I was by the time we were done. Of proposals and discussion papers and comments and the rest. And we had, community, here are workshop tables, people could design their neighborhood, people could put stickies on that. You do all that engagement. We had some large, turnout 100, 150 people showing up at these sessions to come up with a new plan for Northdale.
But let me ask you, let me ask you though, I mean, you've got the older established residents. What sort of new plan are they looking for? They want what they had before, or they were open to a new idea?
By the time we got into the study, they'd come around. I think they finally saw dollar signs, some of them. Right? That they hit you up some in my neighborhood, I actually make out like a bandit. So there are some that probably had that motive. There are others that I think came out of the planning arguments of you're not going back to the way it was, and so what will work in the future. And there are others that So the
die's been cast, right? I mean, the direction, the dam is sort of split. Well, it's moving in a direction, and the toothpaste is out, and you're not going to put it all back in.
Whatever your favorite expression is.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
That's where we were. And so what change will work rather than should there be change, right? Because change is happening whether we legislate it or not. And we don't like the change that's happening without us providing a new planning framework.
I guess there's generational change too in a neighborhood, right? Over time, people are getting older, what have you, and they're starting to move on. Their kids are out and they're sort of elderly now, and their kids are living somewhere else, probably not looking to be back there anyway. So it was time, right? I think if there's one thing that I've learned from not just these 12 years at council, but all of the political work I'd done before, it's that you got to strike when the iron's hot, right? There is a time for all things. Some ideas have to wait.
because they're not ready yet, right? The conditions on the ground aren't ready for the ideas.
Well, I think
and then they
also
are,
too,
and you got to go.
Yeah, exactly. But also too, in terms of the change in the neighborhood, when you start to see schools closing that have been vibrant, active for a while, that's also a good indication that there's not a lot of young families anymore in that neighborhood.
It was.
Like St. Michael's,
right?
for example. Back in my day, I was at St. Louis, St. Agnes, St. Thomas, St. Michael's, Lourdes. These are all vibrant Catholic elementary schools up to grade 6.
St. Mike's, which is now the Lazaritas, economics, math, business. I forget the whole name of it, but the Lazaritas School. And then the Northdale Public School, just a few blocks north, which Laurier also owns. And is mostly a research facility. It's got a community garden in the back, which is actually very active and a very nice part of the neighborhood.
Nice.
And it's next to WCI, right? The Waterloo Collegiate Institute, which was Mayor Halloran's alma mater. So, I mean, everybody had sort of an interest in, Mark Whaley grew up across the street. So council had an interest.
And they're all seeing the change that's happening. They're all seeing the change that's happening in this neighborhood. And so what was the general idea then for what the consensus concept for Northdale then?
Yeah, well, and this is where we had the community actually sort of write the vision statement rather than the consultants do it. And so I'll read it to you because it's the best way to sort of encapsulate the summary, right? This is 2012. By 2029, Northdale is revitalized and re-urbanized into a diverse, vibrant, and sustainable neighborhood integrated with educational, residential, commercial, cultural, heritage, and recreational facilities and improved open space, pedestrian, cycling, and transit networks. It was the idea of turning it from like a sleepy 1950s suburb, which is what the planning framework said, even though that's not what was happening on the ground, into that diverse, vibrant, mixed-use neighborhood that's sustainable, where people are walking, biking, and taking transit rather than driving, because they're next to everything they need. And it houses the growth in the universities, and you're able to reintroduce, more people because you've got spaces that will work for different kinds of different
but
kinds
in terms of the
folks.
housing concept, so this is an intensification concept.
Yeah, so the planning permissions were like around the edges. It had already been sort of authorized to go up to like 25 stories.
Massive.
But that had existed for quite a while. That was pre-existing. Right. It just hadn't been built out fully, right? But then inside Northdale, the lower part near Laurier, you could go up to 12 stories. And in the rest of the neighborhood, 4 to 6 was sort of possible with different densities. So low density in Northdale could go up to 6 stories. And sort of meet some of that.
And so this was, with time, became generally accepted. What time frame were we talking about in terms of your first meetings and all the subsequent meetings to the point where there's an actual plan that's adopted by council?
The plan was adopted in June 2012, so a year and a half from when the council term started. About a year since we had the consultants on board running it. It was what we were told by the consulting team. Extraordinarily ambitious in terms of timing, and we got it.
Yeah, I was going to say
we made the timeline.
It's an ambitious plan with an ambitious timeline. I mean, that I think is probably largely unheard of to have that sort of change so quickly or adopted so quickly.
Yeah, we had the commitment of council, staff were but behind it. We had paid enough money to have a consulting team ready to put the hours in to do it, and they did come in under budget. There was still some money left, which is good. And because we needed it for to kickstart some things. And and then the committee sort of came around to a consensus viewpoint. It was raucous at times, but we had a broad consensus. If there was anything, there were folks that saying maybe that's going to be too much housing and too much density, the universities were saying. And boy, am I glad now, looking at our current housing crisis, that we had a plan that was much more future-proofed than folks were thinking in 2012, because we need all the housing we can get.
Well, yeah, I mean, intensification. I mean, Waterloo is way ahead of the curve in terms of student housing. I mean, you go to any other, like my girls went to Queens, Ottawa, Guelph Humber. You're trying to find them places to stay, and everything else was very difficult. I can't imagine now. I grew up in Waterloo, so my Italian mother took care of me, so I had no interest in moving out at all. So, and I lived 5 minutes from Laurier, where I went. Yeah. But so my friends were getting places, but I can't imagine what it would have been like if we didn't have the initial around the ring, but now with Northdale, the additional. and the acceptance of the neighborhoods over that.
Yeah. Well, these sort of purpose-built, student housing, right? It's not a technical legal term, but it's a form of housing that you sort of see, certainly saw in the latter 2000s and the early sort of phase that was really targeting students. There is more purpose-built student housing in Waterloo than in the rest of the country combined, right? Like that was sort of the data that we were seeing. So this was the epicenter. Folks that learned how to do it here have tried to do it in other communities and have been moderately successful to not successful in some places, because there's a resistance to the idea that you should accommodate and house students, even though the vibrancy that comes from universities into your local economy, into jobs, into your local tax base, kind of wouldn't happen without them.
Well, we're seeing the problem now with the foreign students and saying come learn here, but we don't have spaces for them.
Yeah,
a huge problem.
It's a huge problem. Study that came out in sort of September in Waterloo. It was the first update in about 7 years. We started that under my sort of council terms to sort of do those updates at town and gown and really understand what the dynamics were. And in the mid 2010s, the idea was, oh my God, we've got too much housing. We should put the brakes on. And I said, hold on.
Yeah,
one, we're going to need it. Two, the vacancy rate is now up over 3%. We now have a renter's market for the first time in 30 years in Waterloo. Why are you saying this is bad?
Right.
And what you saw in that data is rent prices flatlined, which or went down, and on an inflation-adjusted basis, dropped over that period because supply works.
Yeah.
And then Conestoga opened their campus on University Avenue, and then the rest is history. Is now it used all the excess capacity and then some. And so now we need more development.
Massive. Just quick, let our listeners know what Larch Street and Woonerf is.
Yeah, so just high level, right? We definitely had the land use plan to sort of say what could private developers do, but it also came with a streetscaping plan we sort of did later for what happens in the public realm. How do we create this vibrant, reurbanized community where people are out and about and doing all of that? And the ideas the consultants sort of came up with that we put into place was have a pedestrian first street. Right? A Woonerf is a Dutch term that means shared street, but it only functions to share space between cars and people on foot or with strollers or bikes if the cars aren't moving very fast, right? So it's designed to be like 20K speeds where there aren't really curbs. People can sort of walk about and do some of that. And it was one of the last ribbon cuttings I got to do before I left council was to open that street officially. And that was a very exciting sort of.
And that's
endpoint.
Located approximately where?
It's located between the two former elementary schools that closed down. So in the heart of the neighborhood, between Northdale Public School owned by Laurier and Lazaretus, right? And the idea was this was a good street. It would be flanked by density, but it's a bit of a north-south spine between post-secondary institutions and the rest. And that over time, that would become a high pedestrian thoroughfare, and so it was the right place to try something new, and so the city got to learn about how to do that.
So Jeff, we're gonna wrap up in a minute, but tell me, how do you feel about the Northdale work that you did?
It was a phenomenal introduction to how communities can work together to come up with new ideas. As I said, I got elected with an idea of what the plan should be. And the plan that the community came up with together through this process was different than what I had, right? But it worked. It was different from what the residents were thinking, some of them during the election time. But we ended up in a consensus place that worked. And the private sector has built that out in spades. They took it up immediately. They absorbed the need. And we've been able to learn a lot at the city about creating these kinds of mixed use spaces. The regulations there led to some of the things we started doing citywide around shadows and tower performance to be able to get the sun down to the street.
Isn't that sort of the essence, the seduction, the joy of municipal government, the opportunity to actually build your community? I always say it's like real life. My kids used to play a game I think it was called Sims, a computer program where you'd have these buildings and that sort of thing. This is real life Sims, the opportunity to do those sorts of things.
Yeah, and in real life sims, sometimes a pandemic comes along, right? So it's there is a reality between doing some of that. But I live just outside the neighborhood, but I have windows that look onto it. Certainly, when I go up to my top amenity floor at the top of my building,
Right.
I always used to go up to the walking track that we've got there. Up at the top of the building and just look at all that was happening over the 10 years I was on council, because every time I went up, something had moved, something had changed.
Well, Jeff, we got lots more to talk about in a second show, like 30 kilometers, finance, a whole bunch of other things. We'll even maybe touch on Evolve and other environmental stuff. So listen, thanks again for being part of the show today. And I look forward to our next discussion.
I do as well. We can talk about how we funded this whole project too.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, we'll do that.
Thank you for listening to another edition of the Old Grey Mayors podcast. If you have any ideas for stories or people you would like us to interview or reach out to, please feel free to contact us. And thank you again.